7 Interesting Facts about the long reign of Emperor Basil II. Emperor Basil II had one of the longest reigns of any Byzantine ruler. Under his direction and skillful administration, Byzantium grew to the largest it had been in 4 centuries. Basil II was arguably one of the Byzantine Empire's greatest emperors. His reign was the longest of any emperor, and during his 65 years on the throne, his achievements were numerous. He expanded the empire to its greatest extent in 4 centuries, whilst also stabilizing the treasury and building up an impressive surplus. He not only overcame 2 enormous rebellions that threatened to depose him, but he also succeeded in checking the power of the great Eastern aristocrats who had so nearly caused his downfall. Upon his death, Basil II left an empire that was far larger, more prosperous, and more formidable than it had been for several centuries. Born in 958 to Emperor Romanos II and his second wife Theophano, Basil II was considered to have been porphyrogenitos, or born in the purple. Essentially, this meant that he was born while his father was emperor. The origins of this term likely derive from the fact that Byzantine emperors wore imperial purple, a luxury dye obtained from sea snails. As the dye was exceptionally difficult to produce and was therefore highly expensive, it became a status symbol during the Roman period. By the 10th century, sumptuary laws in the Byzantine Empire prohibited anyone except the imperial household from wearing the color. Porphyrogenitos also had a more literal meaning too. There was a room in the imperial palace reserved for the empress, which was lined with porphyry, an igneous rock which is a deep red-purple color. In particular, this room was used by reigning empresses for childbirth, meaning that children born to a reigning emperor were, quite literally, born in the purple. To secure the line of succession, Basil's father Romanos II had his 2-year-old son crowned co-emperor in April 960. This turned out to be a shrewd move, as Romanos died suddenly in March 963 at the age of only 24. Some historians theorize that his death may have been the result of poison and that his wife Theophano was likely the culprit. In any case, Basil II and his younger brother Constantine were far too young to rule, so the Senate confirmed them as emperors with their mother as their legal regent, although in practice power was wielded by the Parakoimomenos, an office comparable to the chief minister of the empire, Joseph Bringas. However, Bringas' reign was short, as the popular general Nikephoros Phokas, fresh from the victorious conquest of Crete, was proclaimed emperor by his army. Bringas fled Constantinople and Phokas marched on the city. The people welcomed him, and he was crowned emperor in August 963. Phokas married Basil, Theophano's mother. Phokas was killed in a plot. Phokas's nephew John Tzimiskes ascended the throne, exiling the cunning Theophano to a convent. John died in 976 and Basil took power. Basil's rather imposing nickname derived from his lengthy and brutal conflict with the Byzantine Empire's most formidable European enemy, the First Bulgarian Empire. Tsar Samuel of Bulgaria held vast territories stretching from the Adriatic to the Black Sea, some of which had once belonged to the Byzantines. Samuel had even succeeded in capturing Mysia, a region along the coast of the Black Sea, while Basil II was distracted by internal rebellions. By the 990s, Bulgarian forces were raiding deep into Byzantine territory, even reaching as far as central Greece. The situation was intolerable, and by the year 1000, Basil had quashed internal dissent and was finally able to focus upon the external threat faced by the power of the Bulgarian Tsar. Basing himself in the city of Thessalonica in 1000, Basil began a series of campaigns that conquered the old Bulgarian capital of Great Preslav in 1000, and the cities of Vodina, Varoya, and Servia in northern Greece in the year 1001. In 1002 the Byzantines occupied Philippopolis, blocking the east-west roads and cutting Mysia off from Macedonia, the heartlands of Samuel's Bulgarian Empire. Following Basil's capture of Vidin, Samuel retaliated with a large-scale surprise raid which took the major Byzantine city of Adrianople. The returning Bulgarian army was intercepted by Basil and defeated, leading to the recovery of the looted treasures of Adrianople. Following this setback, Samuel was forced into a defensive stance, and the Byzantine Empire's advances were slow over the next 10 years of conflict. Gathering his resources, Basil II launched an enormous offensive in 1014 aimed at finally crushing Bulgarian resistance. On July 29, 1014, Basil outmaneuvered and utterly destroyed Samuel's army at the Battle of Clydian. It is his actions after the battle that cemented his reputation as the bulgar-slayer. Basil had almost 15,000 Bulgarian prisoners blinded, sparing one man in every 100 so that he could lead his comrades back to their czar. Samuel was so distraught by this horrific sight that he suffered a stroke and died 2 days later. By 1018, the Bulgarians had finally submitted to Basil, and Byzantium once again had its ancient Danubian frontier. Unlike many of his predecessors who had overseen military campaigning from the safety of Constantinople, such as his grandfather Constantine VII, Basil II was an active emperor. He spent a great deal of his reign accompanying and personally commanding Byzantine armies. Not only would Basil travel with his troops, but he would also share in their hardships too, supposedly even going so far as to eat a standard soldier's rations while on campaign. Not only this, but he laid aside provisions for the dependents of dead officers, caring for their children through gifting them shelter, food, and education. As a result, Basil's armies were generally very loyal, and he was extremely popular with the soldiers. The actual size of the Byzantine Empire's army under Basil is not known, but some estimates suggest that there may have been just over 100,000 men, not including the Imperial Guard units, the Tagmata, based in Constantinople. At the start of his reign, the young and inexperienced Emperor Basil II was faced with a serious threat to his authority. In the east, powerful Byzantine families had built up vast estates over several centuries and were effectively functioning as feudal overlords, wielding enormous influence within their territories and across the empire at large. The greatest of these families possessed the independent power and wealth to raise the flag of rebellion against the emperor himself. In 976, the Scleroi family did just that. The experienced and successful general, Bardas Skleros, who had been a trusted advisor of the previous emperor John I, fermented rebellion after being deposed from the position of domestic of the schools, the highest military office in the empire. Allying himself with Armenian, Georgian, and Muslim rulers, Bardas used his followers to capture most of Asia Minor. To deal with the threat, Basil recalled the exiled Bardas Phocas, a general who had revolted against John I. Bardas Phocas succeeded in traveling to the east and coming to an agreement with David III Kuropalates of Tau, with the Georgian prince pledging 12,000 horsemen to Phocas. Skleros immediately moved to confront Phocas, and on March 24, 979 the armies fought a battle. The two generals personally fought in single combat, with Phocas succeeding in wounding his adversary's head. Although Skleros escaped, rumor of his death put his army to flight, and his rebellion began to disintegrate. Phocas was able to subdue the remnant without too much difficulty. However, the threat of the great eastern families did not end with the defeat of Bardas Skleros. The Parakoimomenos Basil Lekapinos, who himself had acquired great estates in the east, conspired with Bardas Phocas and the exiled Bardas Skleros to rebel and depose Basil. Their inability to influence the energetic Basil, combined with his efforts to curb the power of the eastern families, agitated them into open rebellion. Phocas' rebellion was very similar to Skleros. The general raised his forces in Asia Minor in 987 and besieged Abydos on the Hellespont, with the intention of blocking the Dardanelles and access to Constantinople. Basil II was able to procure troops to combat this threat by marrying his sister Anna to the Grand Prince of the Rus, Vladimir the Great. The Rus leader not only sent a large army, including a contingent of 6,000 Varangians, but also agreed to convert to Christianity. Slowly Basil's forces advanced on Phocas, who became increasingly desperate as his supply lines were cut off and his allies began to desert him. In early 989, Basil's forces were fast approaching Abydos and Phocas prepared his armies for battle, only to suffer a seizure and die on March 16 before the two sides could meet. After his death, Phocas' rebellion quickly collapsed, and Basil's reign was secure.